Hello, global gardeners. Are you ready to start another fantastic gardening week? I know I am. It's nice to have you all here today. I want to focus today on questions. First off, what are your top questions? But also to help maybe define what questions you should be asking in your garden. I think there's a lot of information out there. I know there's a lot of information out there. The key is trying to access it to get the answers to the questions that really make a difference to you. So often I get questions, hundreds a week, of course, as you might imagine. And many of those questions are basic questions, and the kind of questions that I think even new gardeners don't necessarily need to ask someone else because they can probably figure it out for themselves. So, for instance, if you know how to transplant a pepper plant, then you know how to transplant a tomato plant, and you know how to transplant pretty much any other plant in the garden. And so look at it from that perspective. What is happening in your garden that has the same basic skills? And do you need to ask anything extra? For seeds, same basic idea. If you know how to plant a pea seed, you can plant a bean seed. So the basic skills require initial education, asking the questions or finding someone to show you for the first time. But don't think that you need to keep asking those same basic questions. Instead, I encourage that you try to elevate the level of your questions because there's just so much information out there. So I'll pose a question to you to maybe get your mind thinking and maybe to gear up some questions that you want to ask me. And my question is, what is your biggest concern? Or what is your biggest problem in your garden? That's what you should be asking questions about. So often we're focused on the mundane, the basic, the things we're doing every day, and we think we need to know more information about that, when maybe we should be focused on those things that are so terrible in our garden that we need to find out how to fix it. And surprisingly, many of those fixes are easy. They come with experience. And so once you get that experience, you wonder why it was ever a problem. But until you have that problem and ask the question and learn about it and then develop that experience, it could be an issue. So let's focus on some of those things. By all means, ask any question you want to ask, but give me some tough questions. Give me some of those things that you haven't been able to get an answer to or that are most concerning to you, and we'll talk about some of those things and maybe how we can approach an answer. When I was at the help desk for the Master Gardener program 20 years ago, as part of the Master Gardener training, new Master Gardeners go to the help desk and they are there all day long. And the public comes in and asks questions, and we have to give an answer. Now, our education only consisted of about 4 months of classes once a week, which was a lot. We knew more than we did going into it. But the questions we got from the public, that was really the big education as part of the Master Gardener program. It was having to find an answer to a problem that really developed in me the ability to think analytically in the garden, to do that detective work that I often talk about in these live chats, to see something happening and then carry through the possible causes of it so that you can get to a solution. So I'll be touching on that over the course of the morning. I want to give a shout out, of course, to all of the regulars that I see who have been waiting for a long time. Always nice to see that Rick is staying up so late for us in Australia. And of course, Heidi and Jay, the fantastic moderators who keep everything flowing. Shout out to Sunset Gazing for gifting some Gardener Scott memberships today. That's always fantastic. And nice to see that you're here and helping support the channel in that way. And so I'll just scroll through and see kind of these. Yeah, Sunset Gazing is asking about the memberships and who receives them. And I really don't know how that works. So if you received a gifted membership, share the love. Let us know. By all means, let Sunset Gazing know that you appreciate it, because I don't know if it's somebody who is active in the chat. I had always assumed that's the way it worked, but I don't know for sure. So if you were gifted a membership, by all means, let us know in the chat, and we appreciate having you here. Christine Peters is asking, how does anyone store kitchen scraps for compost? We make a lot each week, and I need ideas when I don't have enough browns. So that's a good question. So the idea behind composting is the browns and the greens. We want to mix the greens, the fresh material that is high in nitrogen, like kitchen scraps, with the browns, which are generally the dried materials that are high in carbon. And so we mix the nitrogen and the carbon organic matter together, and that creates compost. When you get the mixture right, along with the proper humidity, or not humidity, moisture levels, you can have a hot compost pile. We're talking 160 degrees Fahrenheit, 71 degrees Celsius, and that breaks down all that organic matter very, very quickly. And before you know it, you've got compost to use in your garden. The problem is what you do with all that material. Now, I tend to have the opposite problem, where I have too many browns. I have too much that builds up and is dried out, and I have to try to figure out a way to get more of the greens, the nitrogen, into it. One of the most common ways is to store it in a bucket, in a container of some type, until you have enough. Now, in the kitchen, that does create a problem, because if you throw all your kitchen scraps in a bucket and put the bucket underneath your sink, within a few days, it's going to start stinking, because we have two different types of bacteria that are decomposing that organic matter. In the compost pile, when we mix the browns and the greens, we have aerobic bacteria. There's oxygen in that pile that's feeding that aerobic bacterial growth, and that helps break down the material. And a good compost pile does not smell. In a bucket, as that material starts breaking down, the anaerobic bacteria come into play, and it's the anaerobic bacteria that causes that smell. So the way to store compost, or not to store compost, to store the kitchen scraps that I use, is a bag, just a produce bag that I get from the store. And I'll put my salad cuttings, banana peels, apple cores, whatever I collect over the course of a day, and I put those into that bag. And then I'll do it again for the second day. Now, by the second day, the bag is getting pretty full. And if I leave it too long, it's going to start leaking and it's going to start smelling. So I move it outside. Now, I practice lazy composting, where I just throw all the ingredients in the compost pile, brown and green, on top of each other whenever they're available. It takes a much longer period to break down all of that matter, but it still works. If you are actively trying to get a hot pile, do the same thing. Just collect everything indoors for a day or two, and then take it outside and put it into a bucket, a 5-gallon bucket, a 30-gallon trash can, whatever you have, and realize that it's going to smell. It's going to have an issue while you're waiting to develop all of those, or collect all of those browns. You can still use it. The anaerobic bacteria will begin breaking down all that fresh, high nitrogen green material. As long as it's outside in a bucket, hopefully it's not going to cause problems with the aroma. Now, when you collect enough browns, you can just dump that whole bucket in. It's probably going to be mushy. It's probably still going to have some aroma, but it still has all of that good high nitrogen material to use. So don't think that you have to use the fresh greens with your browns in the compost pile. You can use old greens that have already started breaking down to go to that compost pile. So that's a method I've used, and it actually works out pretty well. Bowtie Life is saying my okra is dying. Same bed for 3 years, but always add 8 to 10 inches of compost on top. I've never had so much dying. Moisture is good, and sun is long. So it's possible, and I've touched on this a few times. You can get too much nutrition in the soil. You can add, especially if you're adding 8 to 10 inches of compost every year, that could be too much. And because what happens, particularly with a nutrient rich compost, is it can block out some of the other nutrients that the plants need. So when we use compost, I recommend that you mix it into the soil because your soil has a lot of nutrients as well, primarily the ones like magnesium and calcium and sulfur. Those are going to be more in the soil, whereas the nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, the big three macronutrients, are primarily going to be in the compost. So compost mixed with soil gives you a good balance of the nutrients. And so if you run into a problem, and generally you'll start seeing it at about the 3 or 4 year point, especially the 5 year point is what I've seen when your bed is just too rich. And that's a possibility. The okra is just not getting a balance of the nutrients that it needs. If it's getting the water, and if it's getting the sun, and if it's getting the care from you, and this is the first time that you've been having issues, this gets back to that basic master gardener philosophy of what's different, what has changed over the course of a few years. Every year you're adding more compost, but you're growing the okra the same way. Well, maybe it's that addition of the compost every single year. That's what's changed. Every year there's more of it. So that's why I touch on that as a possibility that it's excess compost. You can actually have too much compost because it will lock out some of the micronutrients that plants need, and can actually lock out some of the other macronutrients. When we see this with the tomato plants, if the calcium is locked out of the tomato plant, you get blossom end rot. Doesn't mean that there's a deficiency in the soil. It just might mean that some of those other nutrients are in so much abundance that the plant is absorbing those to the point that it's not absorbing some of those other nutrients. So I would suggest, especially with all of that every year, cut back on some of that. Do a soil test. I did a video on that a couple years ago where I actually tested the soil in my raised bed after I'd been amending it for 3 years. And that's what I found. My bed was actually very high in some of those nutrients, to the point that if I had continued that same regiment of putting all that compost in, it could get too high. So when you do your compost regimen, try to balance it out and do a soil test, and maybe you realize you don't need as much. Rocket P is saying cabbage head still not firm, transplanted in spring. Should I pull it? I would consider that. Yeah, that's one of those things, particularly as we start getting into summer and the heat of those kind of plants, brassicas in general. You're going to have issues with the heat, and so the plant is not going to be responding. They tend to get the good growth, the firm growth, the point of harvest growth in cooler temperatures, and so the heat is probably kind of restricting that. Go ahead and taste it as two. Pull off some leaves, see how it tastes. If it tastes okay, but you just don't have a firm head, yeah, go ahead and pull it, harvest it, use it. And now is actually the middle of summer, is a pretty good time for many of us, even in Michigan. I just have been doing this over the last couple of weeks, putting in new seeds for a fall crop. And so if your spring crop coming into summer is not giving you the results that you're looking for, go ahead and pull those plants and put in some new cabbage seeds or lettuce seeds or spinach seeds or beet seeds or whatever you like to grow going into the fall. And you can still use that bed to continue growing crops. I talked about this a few weeks ago, just how difficult it can be for us to kill our plants or harvest our plants. We want everything to be perfect. And when it's not, we hesitate, hoping that it will get better. And sometimes it just doesn't get better. And cabbage is kind of one of those plants. It has its normal growth cycle. It gets bigger, the leaves start forming, and then they start becoming firm for a head of cabbage. And if that doesn't happen at that normal timing, it's probably not going to happen at all. And so you have to deal with it. And that might mean pulling the plant. So let's see. DLR 978 says, I found that thinking about plants in family lines like cucurbids, brassicas, nightshades, simplified things a lot. Absolutely. Great way to do it. The basic rules apply to everyone in a family, so there's less to remember. Great suggestion. Absolutely a great tip. And that's a really good way of saying it from how I began, that the basic tips or basic methods that we use in the garden pretty much are standard. And by family, yes, absolutely. When you're talking nightshades, the tomatoes and the potatoes, there's a lot of similarities in how we care for those plants. And the brassicas as well, the cabbages and the cauliflower and all of the cool season plants that we're growing are pretty similar. Broccoli and cauliflower and cabbage look different, but the care is essentially the same for all three. So great tip, great suggestion, and a great way to break down the information. You don't have to know everything about every single plant. If you can group it into categories like your vegetables and your flowers and your trees, that's a great way to break down the information. Or by brassicas and nightshades, that's another great way to break down the information. And it condenses what you need to know, and then you can use it in many different ways. So I really like that idea. Terry's asking, are caribou potatoes determinant? Can't find anywhere. They are mid-season. I actually lived in Caribou, Maine for a while, and great potato country up there. And I don't know for sure. I did grow caribou a long time ago. Because of where they get the name and how they're grown, my initial guess would be that they are determinate because they have been grown to harvest. And generally the potatoes that are grown on farms for harvesting are determinate potatoes, because like determinate tomatoes, again, same family, they're going to put on their crop all within a brief period of time, within a couple of weeks. So the determinate tomatoes are setting flowers and giving you fruit within a couple week period. And the potatoes are the same thing. They're all going to grow to about the same size and give you the tubers within the same basic period. So I don't know for sure, but my strong guess is that they are determinate. And this is one of those, I talked with Tony O'Neill recently, and he's put together his potato guide. So if you missed that live stream about potatoes with Tony O'Neill, look it up. Go back into the Gardner Scott Library for these live streams. And no doubt, I'm guessing Jay is getting ready to post a link to that show. But Tony has a reference guide now that will give the very specific information. So you can go to that show, get the link to Tony's information, and then type in caribou, and it will tell you for sure whether it's a determinate or an indeterminate plant. And I may have to do that after the show so that I can follow along and see if my guess was an accurate one. Gina says, my neighbors don't properly protect their chicken feed and now have an army of baby rats eating my tomatoes, beans, whatever's ripe. best non-poisonous control methods. I'm sorry to hear that. So there's two primary things that I use when it comes to those kind of pests, the vermins. Three ways that I prefer to do it. Some are quicker than others. So a barrier, if you can do it, and so that's what I use in most of my beds. That's why I keep my hoops up all summer long. I put bird netting over the plants to keep my dogs and the birds out, especially of the strawberry plants. I will put row cover fabric or insect mesh fabric over the beds if there's that kind of pest that's coming into the garden. And so particularly the rats, if you have beds that you can put hoops over and cover it with a mesh to keep them out, that's helpful. And then in conjunction with that is to give them an alternative. So they're eating all the chicken feed and moving to your garden. Well, pick a spot between your neighbor's chicken feed and your garden and create a rat feeding area. Basically, it's like feeding the birds, or as I've mentioned before, my brother and sister-in-law feed their squirrels for the same reason. You set up a squirrel feeder, a bird feeder, or a rat feeder so that that's where they eat, so that they don't venture into your garden to eat your plants. And so a barrier to try to keep them out, and then an alternative so that they don't even come into the garden are the two most effective ways that I deal with those kind of problems. And then the third is a long-term activity. And so on my Instagram this week, I posted a picture of a hawk that was actually in my garden. And as I walked out, the hawk, along with some other birds, went flying away, and it landed on my neighbor's roof. Well, that's the third thing I do, is to create a wilderness area, so to speak, that is wildlife friendly. I leave brush piles. It's actually certified, but my garden is certified by the National Wildlife Federation, and I have a video on that from a few years ago. And so I've got the trees and the brush piles and the weeds, things to attract wildlife of all type, but particularly the predators. And so I don't have a rat problem. A few years ago, I did have a mice problem, but got rid of that because of the hawks and the owls and the feral cats. And even my dogs play a good role in keeping a lot of those pests out of the garden. So look at that as a long-term approach. What you can do to attract some of those predators so that you don't have to keep feeding the rats. I know that's one of those things, you want to get rid of the rats, but getting rid of rats that basically your neighbor has created an environment that supports them, give them an alternative initially, and then you can start working on ways to attract some of those wildlife predators that might actually help out. Boothby Gardens is asking, when taste testing various tomatoes, what do you use to cleanse your palate between tomatoes? I use saltine crackers. And so I've done some videos where I do like garlic tasting. I'm not sure if I think I showed the crackers in that video. I'm not sure if I did or not. But just something really bland, and then water. And when we film, I'm planning to do a tomato tasting video to come. But it depends on how precise you want to be. So the video I've got coming out this week will be on strawberries. And it looks like I tasted all those strawberries back to back, but I actually did it over a period of time. And I shot that video, I think, over a course of 3 days, maybe 4 days. And that's how I was able to actually get a difference in the taste, was just a time difference. I wasn't eating the strawberries back to back, even though it looks like that in the magic of video. Instead, I would taste and shoot for one day, then I would come back the next day and taste and shoot for another day, so that I could ensure that I had a relatively clear palate when I was tasting the strawberries. When I sit down at a table, like I did with the garlic video, it was saltine crackers in between. And When I've done wine tastings, same kind of thing. It's usually some type of bland cracker that help cleanse your palate, and throw that in with some water. Don't use a fruity beverage or milk or something like that, because that'll throw off the taste profile as well. But it is fun to do those kind of things. If you haven't done a taste comparison in your own garden, do it. If you're growing more than one or two varieties of tomatoes, do a harvest of all your tomatoes, set them side by side along with your family and friends, and actually do a tasting. It's actually kind of fun. And it's, if you want to take a step further, that's what I did for the garlic video, was to actually give notepads and let people take notes as they're tasting all of these different types of garlic or tomatoes or potatoes or peppers or whatever it is that you want to taste. And then if you are really serious about it and want to take accurate notes, something like a bland cracker or bread to cleanse your palate in between. That's basically just to get your tongue ready for the new flavors of what you're going to be doing again. So that's a lot of fun. It really is. And I mentioned it in the strawberry video, but my granddaughter helped out with the tasting, and it was great to see her reaction to all the different strawberries. So it's one of those things I do encourage, that you do more than just harvest and eat. Take some time to enjoy and see the differences in the flavor profiles. Christine's asking, how do you dry out greens? I have lots of pruning greens. So if you're talking about for the compost pile, I just lay them out on the ground and let the sun dry them out. And so when I'm pruning, even my tomato plants, when I prune the branches and the suckers off my tomato plants, I just lay them out in the sun. Most of the time, like I said earlier, I'm looking for greens for my compost pile. So I'll throw them in as greens. But during that time of year, when I'm doing a lot of pruning of my plants and pruning off the tomatoes, and I'll even prune my pumpkin plants, my squash plants, and there's a lot of that green material, then I just lay it out in the sun to dry. And in my low humidity Colorado air, it actually gets pretty dry by the end of a week. And so then I throw it in with fresh materials. And that's what I do with all those pruned greens that I am adding to the compost pile. And Gina's saying, I layer my greens with straw from purchased bales. That aerates and gives browns. That's actually a nice idea. If you've got a lot of those pruning greens, put some layers of straw in there in the sun as well. And then you've essentially created the start to a compost pile. Great idea. Emily's saying, my tomatoes had blight badly this year, I'm guessing due to an exceptionally rainy season. How do I proceed for next year, aside from deeper mulch and more careful watering practices? So mulch is a big factor, and there's, depending on what kind of blight you had. So do a little bit of research. This is what I'm talking about when I say take your questions to the next level, because it'll often generate the need for additional research for you to be able to answer your question. So there are a couple different types of blight, and their source is a little bit different. But most of the blight we get in our garden is traceable to the soil. And so if you have bare soil, you're going to have splashing on the soil, and now it splashes onto your leaves and you've infected your plant. Mulch helps with that. A light layer of mulch is better than none, but a thick layer can make a big difference. And keeping the mulch dry makes a difference as well. So I have soaker hoses in my tomato plants, and I laid out the soaker hose, then I put my straw mulch on top of it so that my mulch stays dry, which lessens the chance that my tomato plants are going to be infected and that I'll develop blight in my garden as well. And then the pruning of the lower branches. I have my tomato plants right now pruned up to about 12 inches. I probably will go out and I did a little bit yesterday for some of the plants to take it up to about 15. Some gardeners go up to 18 inches if it's a problem area. And so when you are thinking about those primarily fungal spores that are going to be bouncing onto a plant from the soil, the mulch cuts it down. But then if you prune off all those lower branches, there's no leaves for that to land on and infect your plant. So that's another option. So the careful watering practices, particularly if you can water underneath like a soaker hose, is a good way to do it. If that's not an option, then just being aware and only watering to keep the soil moist, avoiding overwatering and creating a high humid environment, that or high humidity environment that could affect those plants. And you might notice a difference next year by taking some of those protective actions. Francois is asking, I'm gardening in raised beds and have cedar hedges and a silver maple tree in my 50 by 50 garden area. Roots seem to be taking everything I give soil. Any idea on how to keep roots out of the garden? So there's a couple methods. It's difficult with a silver maple tree. I had a silver maple tree a couple gardens ago, and those roots will go a long ways. My tree was probably 50 feet high, and I would get roots 60 and 70 feet away. They're not big roots, and that's an important thing. If you are able to dig a trench around your garden, consider doing that. Most of the roots, those feeder roots that are moving out from the trees, are going to be in the top 18 inches of soil. And the large majority are going to be in the top 12 inches of soil. So if you dig a 12-inch trench and cut all the roots between the tree and between the hedge and your garden, you are going to dramatically decrease the number of roots that are finding their way into the garden. And you can even leave the trench. One method that I've seen recommended is to dig a deep trench. If you can go down 24 inches, that would be ideal. And then bury a 24-inch barrier of some type, like galvanized steel. You can get galvanized sheets of galvanized steel. And if it's a big problem, you dig a 24-inch trench and then you bury 24 inches of galvanized steel in the trench, and that creates a barrier. So when the roots hit that steel, they veer off to the side and they don't make it to your garden. So that is an option. And then kind of along the same lines is to use a barrier at the bottom of your bed to keep the roots from coming in. Now, you can use the really thick landscape fabric, and it's like a woven plastic, and many contractors will use this underneath rock mulch. It's mostly impervious to roots. It does allow some water and oxygen to flow back and forth. So it does create an okay environment for the soil life in your raised beds, and it acts as a pretty effective barrier. By itself, over time, the roots are probably going to find a gap between the fabric and the soil, and you will again have roots growing into your raised beds. So the galvanized steel plate becomes an option, and you might have to remove the soil, lift up your beds, screw the galvanized steel to the bottom of the beds, and then put the soil back in. But that's the basic idea, is barriers to those roots coming into your garden. Every year, you can just get out and dig a new trench and try to cut all those roots. And that is an option that you don't have to worry about putting a metal barrier at the bottom of your bed or burying a metal wall between your garden. Just got to get out there and cut those roots while they're still small before they actually find a way into your garden beds. And that can make a difference and cut down things dramatically. The biggest issue is once the roots find the bed, you're going to get a lot more roots in the bed, because chances are your raised bed soil is much better than anything around it. And that's where more roots are going to grow. So right off the bat, you need to cut the source of those roots and stop them from coming in the bed. Then go ahead and take out any roots that are in the bed, clean up that a little bit, and then just try to keep it from happening again. TJ the Hawk, good morning to you. Is it worth pruning the winter squash sucker vines that come from the same nodes as the pollinated fruit? Yes and no. So generally, I leave those sucker vines. They are still producing the energy for the plant. I will cut off or pull off any flowers that develop on those sucker vines. But as long as they have good leaves and the sun is shining, all of that energy is going into the roots of your plant and then being redistributed to the fruit that you're growing on the plant. So, you kind of, look at it as it's not a zero sum game necessarily, but if you've got 5 of your winter squash growing on a plant and you have 20 leaves, well, then each of those squashes is only getting energy from 4 leaves. But if you've got twice as many leaves, now that squash conceivably is receiving twice as much nutrition or energy to grow. And so by having more vines, you can actually get to the point that you might have bigger squash and it might actually ripen sooner. The other part of the discussion is, where are those vines? Are they creating a problem? Are they going into the pathways? Are they interfering with other plants? That's when I cut those sucker vines. So for the most part, I let everything grow and just fill out. My pumpkin bed is like that right now. It's just growing and growing. I'm letting all the new vines grow and setting up the leaves. Now, I've got 4 good weeks, maybe 6 weeks before my frost hits and my season is done. This is about the time. It's kind of like topping tomatoes. I did a video a few years ago about why you top tomatoes. I talked about it last week with Eli and Kate's garden where they're pruning their tomato plants. When you know your season is coming to a close, don't let new growth develop. So if new sucker vines are starting to appear, go ahead and prune those off before they start growing. And then start cutting the growing tips. You can still leave the sucker vine because those leaves are providing energy, but cut the tip of that vine so it's not growing anymore. So now all that excess energy, those 8 leaves per squash, are going to the squash. If you don't prune off the tips, some of that energy is going into new plant growth. And that's one of those things, and maybe that's why you're asking the question, is we don't want our energy going into new plant growth when we want the energy to be going into the ripening and growth of our fruits. And so I'll probably get to it this week, but that's on my agenda of things to do, is to snip off the tips of all those pumpkin vines that are doing so great so that all the energy is going into the fruit itself. Hopefully, I'll be able to have a harvest before we get to the point that we are going to still have a garden before the frost comes. Bowtie Life says Caribou potatoes developed by the University of Maine, Caribou, Maine. Yep. No one seems to agree on whether they are determinate or indeterminate. So I saw that Tony checked in from Simplified Gardening, and I don't know if Tony knows off the top of his head, but if you missed it, Tony, we had a question about the Caribou potato and whether it's determinate or indeterminate. And my guess was, based on where it was developed and how it is grown, that it is determinate. But I sent everybody over to your guide for the Caribou, and I'm interested to see what your guide is saying about the Caribou. I would tend to give Tony's information more credence because there is a lot of conflicting information, not just with those potatoes in particular, but with a lot of things that happen in our gardens as to what's right, what's wrong, what's left, what's right, what's up, what's down. It's so much of that yeah. we that's why experience becomes a big teacher, and we just have to deal with whatever works best for us. Okay, still scrolling down. Rasha Dove says, what is eating my broccoli transplants? I have netting, but there are holes in the leaves. Slugs, we had a lot of rain this summer. So I can't answer that question because I haven't seen your broccoli transplants. But this is where that detective work comes in. This is where you look at those holes. And so, yes, slugs will make holes in leaves. And yes, a rainy season is likely to produce more slugs. And even if you have netting over it, that's not going to stop the slugs. So, slugs would be a good guess. Go ahead and look at the leaves and then do a search of um, slug holes in leaves, or what, how to see, how to know if a slug ate your leaf, or think of different ways to pose the question. And then see the pictures that are online of slug damage. There's another thing, slug damage to leaves. That's probably what I would do a search for. And if the picture of the slug damage on leaves matches the slug damage you have, then you probably have your answer. But if the pictures are different, now you have to start doing some little deeper investigation and define what the damage is. So you say holes in leaves. Well, are they circular holes? Are they holes that are on the edges, or holes on the inside? And that's how you refine the search. That's how the Master Gardener program taught us to refine our search, is to not just say, I have holes in my leaves, what's eating the plant, but to actually look closer and say, what kind of holes do I have? And what kind of plant is it? So it's a broccoli plant. And so that's how you refine your search, is not all insects will eat broccoli. There's a lot of insects that prefer other plants than brassicas. So you start looking at insect damage to broccoli leaves and see what kind of pictures pop up, and see if those photos match what's happening to your plant. And so when you start putting all that information together based on the huge amount of information online with what's actually happening, then you can find out what the problem is. And phrasing the question is a big part of that. To just ask, what is eating my broccoli transplant? I could give you 20 things that could be eating your broccoli transplants, but I don't know if they live in your area. They live in my area. There might be 20 things in my area that are eating broccoli, but it might not be in your area. So that's how you refine your search as well. When you start looking at particular pests, I don't have a slug problem. So here in my dry Colorado region, I don't have slugs. I know you're envious, those of you who have slugs. So if I see holes on my leaves, I can pretty effectively take that off the list. I have had slugs in my strawberries in rainy years with the beds that were in ground, level next to the grass and other plants. I've never had a slug problem in my raised beds, ever. So holes in my leaves, it's not slugs. Now I narrow it down based on what kind of hole it is, what kind of plant it is, and where I live, to see what kind of insects it could be. And so those are the kind of things that, when we have our questions that we ask of what's happening in our garden, sometimes the person you're asking doesn't have the answer because you haven't provided enough information. So it's providing the information that can really make a difference when you're looking for the answer, when you're trying to find a source that'll give it to you. Brian's asking, would tilling be okay to kill the roots every year? So it depends. So talking about tree roots and how to take care of the roots, If you can till deep enough, then yes, tilling can be a way to kill roots. What happens, particularly if it's a big silver maple tree, it can have some deeper roots than the depth that you can set your tiller to. So if you're trying to get rid of most of the roots in your area, especially if you're dealing with like a hedge where maybe the roots aren't that deep, then yeah, tilling can be a way to kill the roots. But like I was talking about with the trench earlier, it is something you need to do every year to keep the roots from encroaching into your garden. And tilling the whole thing may not be necessary. If you can just cut the root between the tree and your garden, then you don't need to worry about tilling everything. I'm not a huge fan of tilling because soil is just so important and soil life is so critical. And tilling can really destroy the structure of your soil and can really damage the populations of the life in the soil. So it can be an effective method for a number of things, but rather than tilling a whole area if you don't need to, just tilling that one space, that trenched area. And so maybe dig a trench and then till within the trench might be an option where you can make it a little bit easier over the course of the years. That is an option. Leanne's asking, I have powdery mildew all over my squash season. How do I avoid this next season? Do I compost those plants? Powdery mildew is one of those things that we talked about, and I was on a chat recently talking about powdery mildew. It's everywhere. Those spores are everywhere. And the thing about powdery mildew is, unlike the blight that likes a more humid environment, powdery mildew likes a drier environment. And so if it's not raining, there's a good chance you're probably going to get powdery mildew on your squash plants because the spores are everywhere. And so I just accept that probably in about 2 weeks, generally the end of August, beginning of September, every year I get powdery mildew on my squash. It just happens. I don't concern myself because it's not a deadly disease. It's not going to kill the plant. It will affect the photosynthesis. It doesn't look good, but it's not going to kill the plant. It's not going to harm the fruit in any way. You're still going to be able to harvest your squash. I compost powdery mildew leaves because those fungal spores, when they get into the compost pile, are for the most part done. They're not going to be blowing in the wind and infecting other plants in the future. So I don't see a problem with composting those type of plants, those type of infections, because I'm also using mulch. Like I was talking earlier about the fungal spores bouncing from the soil onto the leaves. This is the same kind of issue. If you compost your powdery mildew leaves, and then you work that compost into your soil, any spores that survive the composting process are now buried. And then if you add if you add mulch on top of that, any of those spores that might be on the surface of the soil have no way to find a host on your plant. So I'm not that worried about the powdery mildew. So as far as avoiding it next season, circulation, air circulation, do some pruning. Don't let your squash leaves grow on top of each other and create a real dense area. Air circulation does help. And you can still do that this year. Prune out some of those infected leaves and help improve the circulation. That'll also reduce some of the infection within the plant. But yeah, that's the one disease that I actually don't worry much about at all, because I always get it, I always deal with it, and it's really never an issue. Bowtie Life is saying burying barriers is tough work. It is. We did that at our church in a very large flower bed with commercial weed fabric around and under at a 2-foot depth. Nightmares, but beautiful now. There you go. Yes, it is a lot of work, but that is one of those ways to deal with a lot of roots and to still have a garden when you've got a lot of roots that are posing problems like that. Celsith is saying, my patty pan squash has only thrown out male flowers all year. It's mid-August and I've only just got my first female flower. Is there a way to encourage them earlier? Yeah, one of the, I think I talked about this last week. Stress on the plant and the environmental factors all play a role in how the flowers are forming. And so shade cloth actually can make a big difference, particularly in really hot environments over the course of the summer. If you can put shade cloth over your squash plants, that can make a big difference in getting a balance of flowers that are growing and then also getting good pollination, because the temperatures are staying low for the pollinators and for the pollination to actually happen. The pollen's not killed in high temperatures of our summer sun. So that's one of those things that I would say to encourage it. Fertilizer is not going to work. Any particular type of pruning is really not going to work. It's the environmental factors that really make a big difference. And so those are kind of the things I think would be something that I would work. And that's one of the things I do in my garden is to cover it. And so I'll talk about this. This is actually a picture of my garden this morning. And I love it. For those of you who are regular viewers, you know that most of the year in my Colorado garden, it's brown. There's not much growing. So I love this time of year because I can actually show my garden off. I can actually see the plants growing and share photos so you can all see what's happening in my garden. My pumpkin patch, I was referring to my pumpkin patch earlier, and you can see how wonderful my pumpkins are looking. And they're flowering and they're starting to fruit. A lot of stuff happened late for me this year, and I don't know how good my harvests are going to be, but that doesn't matter. My garden is beautiful right now, and I am so happy with everything that's happening in my garden. And it's interesting, this last weekend I went on a tour of gardens in my area. My garden club does a garden tour every year. We started last year. My garden was on the tour last year. I'll be on the tour again next year. But so we saw some new gardens, such wonderful ways to get new ideas because everybody does things a little bit differently. But one of the big topics in my area and with my gardener friends in particular is grasshoppers. My area has had terrible, terrible issues with grasshoppers this year. And so when I ask, what your biggest problem is, grasshoppers was the biggest problem for many of the people that I talked with this weekend. Many of their gardens were devastated by the grasshoppers. For me, not at all. Not a problem. I think I've seen 5 grasshoppers and I was able to kill 3 of them. Big part of that is when you plant. I planted late for a few different reasons, but by planting late, I missed that life cycle where the grasshoppers were coming into my garden, eating my plants, laying eggs, multiplying, and then creating havoc in my garden for the rest of the year. I missed that this year because I put my garden in late. So as you try to identify what your top issue is and then ask questions about how to prevent it or solve it or deal with it, these are the kind of things where experience comes into play. And I learned long ago, and I've talked about this many, many times, understanding the life cycle of insects is critical in dealing with insects because it affects how you can garden so that problem doesn't happen again. So I've got this big, beautiful garden. You can look at these leaves and there's no damage to any of these leaves. If you can't really see it in the picture above my head here, that's my zucchini. You can see how big my zucchini is popping through the little cattle panel trellis hoops that I've got. I've got some hail damage on the leaves, and that's it. That's the only damage I've got in my garden. No pest damage at all because of how I garden, because I've got all these wild sunflowers that are popped up, and because I allow some weeds to appear around my beds. I've got natural predators everywhere, and they're dealing with the pests in my garden so that I don't have to. It's not a one and done kind of thing, though. We still have to keep looking at the problems in our garden and dealing with them. My forecast today is calling for a big thunderstorm activity this afternoon with the possibility of golf ball size hail. That will devastate my garden. And so, what I've done in recent years, this big white area that you see in the background of my picture here, that's hailcloth covering all of my tomato plants that are growing in that area. And for these other beds that have hoops on them, when I'm done with the show, I'm going to go out and cover all of those beds with shade cloth and hail cloth so that if that thunderstorm hits and we get golf ball size hail, I'll minimize my damage because I took preventive action. I didn't know this until within the last 10 years. 20 years ago, my gardens were leveled every year during the hailstorms that would move through this part of Colorado. I've since learned how to deal with it. Part of it was asking questions, identifying what my top priorities were, which was dealing with the hail, and then asking the question, how do I prevent hail from damaging my plants? And now I garden the way I do because this is the answer that works best for me. That's how I suggest that you look at your garden is one big problem at a time, investigate, ask, try, learn, and then modify how you garden, and maybe that'll make a difference. Serena's asking, when should leeks be planted? We won't start getting fall weather until mid-October. What are soil requirements for leeks? And so fall is generally the time. Leeks pretty much follow the same cycle as garlic. And I don't have videos on leeks, but I got videos on garlic. And like most plants, this is where we can group an answer when you ask what the soil requirements are. Pretty much the soil requirements are the same for everything in the garden. A good, rich, well-draining soil that's full of life. That's the soil requirement. If you can provide that for leeks, for garlic, for tomatoes, for peppers, for anything, then you should have good growth. And so all of these beautiful plants in my garden, no fertilizer at all. All of this is because I've got good soil. So if you can develop your soil, that will fulfill the requirements of the plants. And then for leeks and other plants that will that like the cool weather and need to be in the ground over the winter so you can harvest next year, fall is generally the time to do that. And so when I say fall, yeah, that's a long period of time. That's because the week that I plant garlic and leeks may not be the same week that you plant garlic and leeks. So we need to individualize our gardens because all of our gardens are unique based on our own climate. And that's when going to a local nursery is helpful, and ask the local gardeners, the local master gardeners in particular, what they recommend, because I could tell you that I'm going to be putting in my garlic and leeks in the first week of October. But for you, it might be the third week of October. That's where the experience and the learning and the questioning all really comes into play, because we need to make sure that we're doing it at the best time for us. And particularly those of you in warmer regions, if you were to follow me and put your garlic in the ground the first week of October, you might have some issues because it might start growing and you might actually have full-size plants developed long before the cold weather ever shows up. And garlic, for the most part, really shouldn't be sprouting after you plant it. The roots develop, but we're not growing garlic to sprout before winter. Because if it sprouts before winter and starts growing, and then winter sets in, and all of those leaves are damaged or just die back, all of that energy from that clove to send up that growth is lost. And so next year, those cloves aren't going to grow into as big a bulb as you would normally expect because so much energy was used for that initial growth. That's what we want to avoid. So that's why I say the timing is important and your timing might be different. And that's one of those things you need to find out what tends to work best in your area. So Jay translated for Tron. It's always nice to see Tron here. I hope she's doing well. And greetings to you, Tron, as well. Tron's been a loyal viewer of my channel for so many years. And so, I talk about my global audience, and Tron in Vietnam has been with me for many, many, many years. And she was actually one of the reasons that I started referring to all of us as a global audience. So I think it's nice that we can share ourselves along with at the same time. So we've got Vietnam and we've got Australia, and of course we've got all the others that. But as far as regular viewers, it's nice to see it spread out so far. Sean's wondering, I've noticed some grubs in my compost pile recently. Are these friends or foes? So it depends. And so this is another one of those identification things. Grubs are fantastic. And the Master Gardener program taught me to look at a grub and be able to identify it. And so a grub's going to have 6 legs, and it's going to have the head, and how the head and how the legs form and any other coloration that might be different. And so you might see circles here or circles there. Anyway, you look at those identifying marks on the grubs and you can identify it. So you can actually do online searches for grub with black circles or whatever it happens to be, and look for the photos and try to find a photo that matches the type of grub you have. And that's how you answer your question. Grubs are basically the larval stage of beetles. There are many, many beneficial beetles in our garden. The problem is many of those grubs are going to eat our plants, not all of them. And that's where the identification comes into play, because depending on what kind of grub it is, it may eat a particular type of plant and then emerge as an adult and can be a very helpful part of your garden. So if it's a type of grub that eats brassicas and it's in a bed where there's no brassicas, then allow it to grow and it might be beneficial as an adult. So it's hard to say definitively yes or no, it's good, it's bad, until you identify it and figure out what it is. Most of the time when I encounter a grub, I throw it over the yard to my neighbor's chickens, just because the chickens like grubs. But I don't go seeking the grubs. The only issue I've had with grubs in my garden, because I've identified that most of the grubs that I have aren't a problem, is at the school garden, at the Galileo garden. I had a bed with a lot of organic matter in it. I mean, a lot of organic matter. The grubs were infesting that bed, which normally wouldn't have been a big problem, because that's one of the roles of many of the beetles, is to help break down some of that organic matter and get that decomposition process kicked off. But there were raccoons that found their way into the garden. They tore apart the beds going after those grubs. So good or bad, if you've got a raccoon problem, or if you've got any of those type of predators that are going to be going after the grubs, then I would say get rid of the grubs so that you don't have your beds torn up by those kind of animals. But identifying what it is really the most important factor. And then identifying whether it's good or bad, or has a place in your garden, or whether there's something else that's going to be a bigger problem because it's coming after all of those grubs. Whelmy Dirtbag saying, I'm trying to grow ground cherries for the first time this year, and so far 3 of my 4 plants wilted and died. I'm not sure what is happening. My tomatillos next to them are just fine. Sometimes that just happens. I've tried growing ground cherries, I think 5 times now, and I have yet to have a successful harvest. Now, I don't know if it's our region, and I think that's a big factor in it. So, and here for me in Colorado, I just can't grow the the ground cherries. And if you are in Wyoming, it might be because we've got similar climate and similar soil and similar growing factors. I I don't have a good answer. This is one of those, it was a problem. I tried to figure it out. I had good soil, I had good seed. I think one of the issues I had at first, I was trying to grow ground cherries from seed and directly, and that just wasn't enough time. And so then I tried growing ground cherries like tomatoes and tomatillos, and I would transplant them, and they just never really did well. And then I stopped trying. So I'm not an expert on ground cherries because I haven't had success. And like you, I'm not sure what's happening either. I tried to narrow it down into all the factors I could consider. One year I used shade cloth, didn't make much difference. Other years, full sun didn't seem to make much difference. So sometimes there are just some plants that just don't do well in your garden. And I don't grow ground cherries anymore because I tried over a course of many years and it just didn't happen. I think it was Aunt Molly's ground cherry was the one, and it could have been that variety. So maybe if I tried a different ground cherry, I might have more success. But I haven't done it in the last couple years. So I would say if you want to keep trying, narrow down the factors of what could be causing a problem. If your soil's good, if your sun is good, if your water is good, if your care is good, and they're still not working, sometimes it just might be the climate in general, the humidity, the wind. There are so many other factors that can make a difference in how well our plants are doing that it's really hard to get it narrowed out. And they say I cover my entire Wyoming garden in hail netting, the rows and raised beds, of course. And we had terrible drought all year. So it could be the drought. It could be the lack of rain. I've seen that in some areas of my garden that we haven't had rain this year. But the hail cloth does a great job of adding that little bit of protection and a little bit of shade for my tomato plants as well. And so it's probably the environment. I hate to say that, but that often is the case. Big Will Dog, nice to see you on Monday. My overly dense parsley became home to swallowtail caterpillars and helped me thin some out. Cool. Now they're gone and can't find their chrysalis. Any idea? So that's really cool. I'd love to have some chrysalis on my plants, and I love the swallowtail butterflies. It could be that something ate it, and if you saw that there was a chrysalis and it's gone, yeah, it was that was definitely the problem. If it was the caterpillar and you didn't see it develop and then the chrysalis was there, it could be nearby. And so, especially if you've got an overly dense area, it could be in a different area, a protected area. Chances are they're going to put the chrysalis in an area that isn't going to be exposed to birds. But if you can't find it, it could be that overnight there was some predator that ate the caterpillar. So that's just the way nature works. But I would keep looking for the chrysalis, and especially if you had multiple caterpillars. I mean, there should be some indication nearby, and it might not actually be in the parsley. Look outside the bed and see if maybe you can find something outside the bed, and maybe that'll give you some clues as to what happened to the missing swallowtail caterpillars. That's one of those mysteries that I hope you solve. I'd be interested in finding out if you can determine where they went. Llama is asking, do you know how long chicken manure takes to break down enough to plant it? This is my first year with chickens, and I'm planning on cleaning out the coop in spring. So I like to give the chicken manure 6 months. It's so high in ammonium and that can burn the plants that's the big reason that we don't want to put it directly into the garden. There's also some concern with E. coli and some of those issues if you use it too early and are exposed to it. And so I'll take the chicken manure and keep it in bags, keep it in trash cans for generally six months. And by then, those issues are pretty much gone, and it's not an issue. And depending on where you do it, I've also done it outside. So depends on, most of the chicken manure I get is actually mixed with straw or wood chips. It comes from the chicken coop. And so if I put it into a 50-gallon garbage can or 55-gallon drum or something like that, I'll just load it in, and it essentially starts breaking down. All that nitrogen with the brown starts the composting process. And it's usually aerobic. It doesn't generally smell other than just the basic smell of the chicken manure. But to use it faster, I've spread it out over the ground, like a bare patch of ground, and just spread the chicken manure and the straw and everything else. And the sun will bake it. It'll dry out, and you can use it within a month if you want to take that effort to rake it in the sun and break it down. I tend to take the lazier approach where I just put it in a pile or a container for 6 months and then get back to it. And even then, most of the time I'm adding chicken manure to my compost pile. And so it generally depends on how much straw and wood chips are in it as to whether I'll put it in the compost pile or add it as a mulch or work it into my soil. So, but waiting is a good idea, and fresh manure, chicken manure, is best to be aged at least a little bit before you put it into your garden. A lot of it is how much patience you have before you decide to put it into your garden. And I know patience is one of those things that not all of us have, but sometimes we have to try to get some more patience, I guess is what I'm trying to say, as we get into our garden. Okay, getting close. I think I'm mostly caught up. Gilles is asking, do you have any advice for getting rid of wire worms? They're damaging some potatoes and rutabagas in raised beds. Again, this is one of those lifestyle or life cycle issues. So once the wire worms are there and they're damaging your potatoes, there's not a lot you can do. That damage is going to happen. The key is trying to prevent it for next time. And so they're going to be in the soil, and probably the easiest thing to do is to not do it again next year. So they're in containers. So don't use that soil either in your raised beds, because I often take my container soil and put it into my raised beds as additional organic matter to amend the soil. Don't do that. Don't add that soil into your raised beds, and do new soil for your containers for the potatoes next year. And that's one way to deal with it. If they're in the raised beds where your rutabagas are, that's what it sounds like as well. Same thing. Don't grow those root crops in that bed again, right off the bat. That's a reason for crop rotation. Grow your potatoes, grow your rutabagas in other beds, and then learn about the life cycle. And I'm not that as familiar with the wire worms, but often it's as simple as in spring, just disrupting the soil, just aerating it a little bit, turning it over. That's often enough to disrupt the life cycle of many of those pests that are in the soil. And then after a season, for sure, 2 years, you should be able to eliminate the soil. As long as you isolate it and then deal with the life cycle to try to take care of the problem before it becomes a problem, that's one of the best ways to keep it from becoming a problem in the future. Okay, let's see. Gilles is saying the chipmunks love my ground cherries. So I'm glad that you've got enough ground cherries that you now have to deal with the squirrels eating them. And I wish I had that problem. Like I was saying, I would love to have a harvest of ground cherries. It's just one of those things that I can't seem to do. And okra's the same way. I've mentioned this in the past as well. I don't grow okra for the same reason. I can get okra to grow. I just can't get it to the point to give me a good harvest. And the ground cherries are kind of the same way. The plants grow okay. It's just getting that harvest is really the big problem. So I don't grow okra and I don't grow ground cherries. And all of us have those plants, and they tend to be a little unique, but all of us have those plants that we don't grow because it have taken a number of years, but we realized that it's not worth it. Why devote a plot of your garden to a plant that's not going to produce? And because it's not producing, you're spending more time on it. It's okay to just write it off and say, it was an experiment. It was part of that experience. It was a lesson. Now I'm going to move on. So I would much prefer to grow plants that I know will do well than to keep growing plants that just never seem to do well at all. Heidi's asking, would beneficial nematodes help in the containers to control the wireworms? Possibly. And so again, it's the research. It's identifying just exactly what type of problem it is, if it is indeed wireworms, and then looking at the nematodes, because nematodes are very specific. And so you can't just buy nematodes and expect it's going to be a problem, because there are nematodes that are going to be beneficial for one type of pest and not beneficial for another type of pest. And so that's where the research comes in the investigation, so that you match something like nematodes. There's also some biological controls. I mentioned BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. There are some soil bacteria that you can find not as readily available, but some of that can actually be put into the soil for some of those soil-borne pests as well. So I don't have wireworms, so I don't have the experience to tell you what has worked best for me. But the idea is, again, general answer for lots of problems we have. Soil-borne pests, if you can disrupt its life cycle, and if there is something like a bacterial control or a nematode that deals with it, certainly consider that as an option. It's even though the basic answer can be the same for so many plants, we have to be careful that we don't use that shotgun approach as a solution to all the problems we have. The causes may be similar and some of the corrective actions may be similar, but I'll use insecticides as an example. So many gardeners, particularly new gardeners, will have an insect that appears on their plant and they want to get rid of it. So they buy an insecticide and they spray their garden, and it gets rid of that insect along with a lot of other insects. Without that initial step, this is part of the integrated pest management process. Without that step of identification, it may not even be a problem. Those bad bugs you think are in the garden may actually be good bugs. In fact, it's only about 5% of the insects in our garden that are harmful. So chances are, if you see a bug, it's either a neutral bug or a good bug. And so dealing with a particular pest control may work and it may not, because it tends to be targeted for very specific types of pests, like BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, that we would sprinkle on our plants. That's only going to work for the insects that are eating the leaves, because they need to eat the leaf and then get that bacteria into their gut. It's not going to work on those pests that are not eating the leaves. And so that's the same basic idea with the nematodes. Nematodes are targeted with what they're going to be eating. So a nematode that is around one plant and helping out the plant may not be the same kind of nematode that you need to actually eat a soil-borne pest. So there's just so much information out there, and I know it can become confusing and conflicting, but it is just one of those things that we have to be aware of as we become more experienced as gardeners, is breaking down all these different levels of knowledge and just taking it one piece at a time and trying to learn what we can. Dusty Flats is asking, does backfilling tomato seedlings stunt them while starting them inside? So my experience has shown that it doesn't necessarily stunt them, but it does affect their the growth of the plant over the course of the season. And so, and I did more experimentation on this year, and I did a video a year or two ago where I tried 3 different methods of planting my tomato seedlings from seed, and then either filling them, backfilling, adding soil into the pot, burying them deep, not burying them deep. And what I found was I lost about a week to 2 weeks each time I added soil to the stems of the tomatoes. And so over the course of the season, all the plants did okay. They weren't stunted, but they grew slower. So the seedlings that you're growing, if you are burying the stem as they grow, you're going to get roots on that stem. The problem, as I've been able to determine it, is that takes energy. The plant's energy is going into root development over plant and leaf development. So you've got a small seedling and it's growing great, and then you put it into a bigger pot or you backfill with some soil. Now the energy is not going into the plant getting taller. It's getting so that the roots are actually going to start growing on those adventitious cells on the tomato stem. That takes time, that takes energy. And so when you put it into your garden, it may seem stunted, but really it's maybe 2 weeks behind all of those other plants that were not backfilled, that didn't have a stem that was buried. And when you put it into the garden, I'm not burying my tomato stems like I used to for that same reason. I noticed that when I buried the stem, I was generally 2 weeks later in harvest time, which now meant that I didn't have as big a harvest because my harvest ends when the frost hits. And if things haven't developed to the point where they can be harvested and ripened on the counter, they're lost. And that 2 weeks makes a big difference for me. So it is a loss of time, and that's really a bigger factor. And so, yes, the plant may look stunted in comparison with another tomato that isn't backfilled, but it shouldn't cause overall stunting of the plant. If the plant is stunted, then it's probably some other problem that is causing that issue. And that's where you need to do that investigation as well to try to figure out what maybe it was causing a plant to be stunted. And often it's environmental. And so the weather, the sun, the wind, the temperature, the humidity, those factors have such huge roles in our garden that we often don't think about. We're focused on watering our plants and the soil, and we tend to think that water and good soil will solve all of our problems. Well, the weather can actually create a number of problems. Even when we do everything else right, it can be one of the things that we have issues with. And there's Jay with that video. This will change the way you grow tomatoes. Yeah, it definitely changed the way I grew tomatoes. I've got videos from 8 years ago, I think 9 years ago, and I show you how to plant tomatoes, and I bury my tomatoes. And burying tomatoes is a great option. And all of the things I say in those older videos are still accurate. But what I've learned in these 8 years, particularly with this video that I did some experimentation with, is that it makes a difference. It's a 2 or 3 week difference. And my season just isn't long enough for that. Burying tomatoes still gives you a bigger root system. And so if you have a longer season, by burying your stems, you can get more roots, which can give you a bigger plant, which can give you more harvest. That's the main reason for doing it. Except when you got a short season and 2 weeks will make a difference. And so that's why I so often try to stress our individual natures of our individual gardens, because the basic information may be accurate, may be valid, and may work. It just might not be best for you in your garden. And that's how I approach it. Is I do a lot of different methods, because some of the methods that are best are different than the way other people are doing it. And what's best for a lot of other people, I do some of those, and then there's a lot that I don't do. And you can see my garden, and I'm going to stand tall and proud and say the way I'm growing works for me in my garden in Colorado. And really, that's the biggest issue. And there's, we continually learn things. So you'll see in my video coming out on Thursday on the strawberries that I'm tasting, my new puppy Lika is in a starring role in that video, because I was with her. She was with me doing the strawberries. It was great. It was a lot of fun seeing my little puppy licking the strawberries that I was holding. This last week, I found her in the strawberry bed, in the bed, eating strawberries. These are one of those things that you can't necessarily plan for, and you don't think is going to happen when you do something as innocuous as let your puppy lick a strawberry. So I lost a whole bunch of strawberries this week because my puppy got in the bed and was eating all the strawberries. I had bird netting over those beds to try to keep the birds out, but there was enough of a gap, and she was a strong enough puppy that she was able to barrel through the bird netting and get to the strawberries. I've now had to modify how I grow those strawberries in that low raised bed, and I've got wire on the ends now, so she can't go through the bird netting to get to my strawberries. These are the kind of things that's what gardening is all about, is things happen, and we have to ask ourselves, what happened? How can we fix it? And then take appropriate action to get those things that were happening. And so she hasn't gotten into the strawberry bed since then, but there was a strawberry in another section that I was looking forward to eating today, and it was gone. I have a strong suspicion that my puppy ate that strawberry because she's developed a taste for it. So be careful what you do with the pets in the garden. And one of those things that they're fun and we love them, but sometimes they're the big pests. Shandy's Garden's asking, I tore down a twin bed base and it's the perfect size raised bed. I left the wood frame and fabric cover outside only, filling with organic material now. We'll finish with pallet boards outside. Concerns? I think it sounds great. It's I'm not sure what kind of material the twin bed base is. I'm assuming it's wood. It might be metal. So that would be my first question, is what that material is, because that will affect how long it lasts. And so I've got some bases that are wood, and I've got some bases that are metal. And it sounds like a great idea, especially if it's a perfect size frame. And then you can cover it with a wood frame and fabric. I think it's a great idea. So I wouldn't have many concerns other than just looking to the future and anticipating how long that frame is going to last, and if you're going to need to replace it at some point. And that is probably years down the road. But great idea for reusing a frame. I have the frame of an old bunk bed that I got at I think Goodwill years and years ago, and I use that as a trellis. It's a wonderful trellis. I don't use it every year. I pull it out occasionally, depending on where I'm going to be growing some of my vining plants. But reusing beds really do have a role in the garden. I think that's awesome. Outlier Garden, thank you for that contribution. I appreciate it. I love starting my week with y'all. Well said. I completely agree. I love starting my gardening week with you all as well. So I do this periodically, and as we get to the end of the show, I love it when people that are on the live stream in the chat make a point to talk with me, and we have a chance to talk gardening. So I'll give a shout out to Sean. Sean is one of the newest members of our garden club. He was on the tour this week, and we had a great opportunity to chat about gardening as we were walking through other people's gardens. So shout out to Sean, who's a regular viewer of the Monday live stream. And anytime any of you happen to come across me anywhere, by all means, stop and say hello, because I just love not only the opportunity to talk gardening, but especially talk gardening with somebody who is a regular viewer of the show and may be in the chat. It's so great to kind of have that circle come completely all the way around. So nice to see everybody. Appreciate everyone who has been here today, the truly global audience. And I am so glad, I'm going to brag again. I'm so glad that I can show you this picture of my garden in the background, because it just goes to show that it works. I've been gardening for 35 years plus, and even I start each season hoping that the garden will turn out okay. Not necessarily expecting it'll be okay. I'm pretty sure it will, but just things can go wrong. That golf ball size hail could hit before you get the covers up. The dogs can destroy your garden. There's just so many things that can go wrong. And so I have the same fears that every other gardener has, that this year is just not going to be a good year. So when I do have a good year, it's like, okay, yes, the soil is good, the watering is good, the plant choice is good, the maintenance of the plants is good, covering the plants with shade cloth and hail cloth is working. Now I can relax a little bit and just enjoy, because you hear me say this all the time. And I want you to remember it as you start your gardening week. It's all about enjoying gardening. So just do it. I'll see you next Monday.